In the past few days, President Trump has departed from several of his policy positions. He changed his mind about NATO, which he had previously called an obsolete treaty. He promised to label China a currency manipulator on his first day in office, but just a few days after meeting with the Chinese president, he walked that back. He's also flipped on his prior openness towards Russia. Now he says relations with the country are at an all-time low. Much of the president's evolving stance on policy has been attributed to the tug-of-war between warring factions in the West Wing. It looks as though the populist wing, led by Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, is now being eclipsed by the more moderate wing of advisors, including Gary Cohn and son-in-law Jared Kushner. I want to turn now to John Dickerson in our Washington bureau. He, of course, is CBS News chief Washington correspondent and moderator of Face the Nation. John, your inaugural appearance here on Red and Blue. We're so excited to have your thoughts on what's been a very busy week. So let's start, John, with what we have seen from the Trump administration. A lot of shifting on policy positions, on foreign policy positions that perhaps might have been startling to some and to others, perhaps not startling at all. What do you make of the president's, as he calls it, flexibility on a number of these positions? And what are the consequences, you think, of that flexibility?
Well, I feel like I should give an inaugural address since it's my inaugural appearance. The big question during the campaign about Donald Trump is there were at least two Donald Trumps, and which one was going to show up and which one was going to win the campaign, and then which one was going to be president. One was the tough-talking man of the rallies. The other was the occasionally less visible, more constrained Donald Trump. And that question still comes into his presidency. We have seen more of the sort of campaign rally. President Trump, his inaugural address was a full punch in the nose to Washington. That is what he had promised. But we have slowly seen in various different ways the way that both by his own design, but also by the limits of the office of the presidency, he's been pinned back. The courts knocked back his first travel ban. Then Congress didn't give him what he wanted on replacing the Affordable Care Act. And then he's found, particularly with respect to foreign affairs, that a lot of the things that he promised or said he was going to do as a candidate just can't be done, either with respect to NATO or with respect to China. And so this week we saw in both of those cases the president moving yet another step back from the campaign Donald Trump, who was much tougher, much kind of more crass when talking about China and NATO, has now changed his position. What that shows is that at least at some level, he is adapting to the office. And that was one of the things that those who were nervous about him hoped would happen, that he would be directed and guided by people with more expertise or by events. That's the upside, or the positive way of looking at that. The negative way, of course, of looking at it is that when the president says North Korea is more complicated than he thought, and that health care reform is more complicated than he thought, that he's basically facing a situation as president that's just out of his hands, and that he's doesn't have a system for dealing with those things, and he's sort of at sea. So the question really is he being shaped by events, or does he still retain the ability to dictate the terms of events? And that's something we just don't know yet. And
I wonder, John, of those shifts that we've seen just in the past week, is there one moment that's particularly noteworthy in your mind?
Well, it's a little bit obscure, but it's when the president decided not to when he decided not to declare that China was a currency manipulator. That represented an embrace of just the facts. There is a specific set of criteria that has to be used to name China or any country as a currency manipulator, and China did not meet those thresholds. So no serious economist thought he was actually going to be able to do this. And so it's another one of those places where a thing that he said in the campaign just can't be done in reality. But it also represented The way he tried to use it was basically to say that he was using this as a bargaining chip with China in order to get China to take on North Korea, take on the problem of North Korea, which the president, like previous presidents, would much prefer to have China deal with than to deal with militarily from the United States. But it was also a further step in the president's recognition that China can't be kind of shoved around. And we've seen a number of ways in which the president won by first seeming to challenge the one China policy, then publicly stating that he supported it, and then just the generally more solicitous tone he's taken towards China. Remember, during the campaign, he said that China had been raping America. That kind of talk has gone away. He still talks about trade, but none of the hard talk, because one of the things he's learned from people both in his own administration, but tutors like Henry Kissinger have helped him realize that when you say things about China, they take them very seriously. The notion that his tweets can just be ignored as so much chatter, which the UN ambassador suggested, that's not the way China deals with things. And so this is a recognition that on one country that he paid a lot of attention to as a candidate, he has to deal with them in a very different way as president.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch his evolution. John, on another topic, I want to ask you about the power struggle inside the West Wing between the president's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, and his son-in-law and top advisor, Jared Kushner. Why does that matter? When people hear about this, some might write it off as just media speculation, but why is it significant?
Well, the speculation part, they're probably right in that you get a lot of pundits weighing in on who's up and who's down. You also get a lot of people inside the building making claims about who has power and who doesn't, some of whom know and some of whom are not in a position really to know. But the reason this matters is that personnel is policy in a lot of ways, and particularly with President Trump, who came into office with the admission that he would need direction and guidance on a lot of things because he was new to the political scene. So he is more in need of direction and more guidable than perhaps other presidents on certain things. And we also know from his management style, from those that we've interviewed over time, that he tends to sort of seek opinion that he likes and also tends to be influenced by the last person he talked to. So this means the people who are around him and whose guidance and counsel he seeks, that they are important, and who gets to him and why and in what context matters for the end product. And what's the end product? Well, the end product is the health care law that will affect people's lives, or the harm that may come to people who are sent into various places to take military action. So the decisions all flow from these conversations that take place and for who's in a position to influence the president. And so it really matters. Also, it really matters because you have an ideologically highly diverse presidency here. As one Republican senator was explaining it to me, you have two Democrats essentially in strong, Jared Kushner and his wife in strong positions of power. You also, Gary Cohn, the top economic advisor to the president, is also a Democrat. And then you have Steve Bannon, who's more of a populist nationalist than a straight up Republican establishment figure. You have the only one filling that slot is Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, and then you have the president himself, who this Republican senator placed the president as sort of center left, not center right or all the way to the right. So that's a lot of ideological diversity, which means a lot of clashing of views on what are very important topics. And so who wins the day there depends the direction in which the administration ultimately goes.
Well, John, you're a student of history. Put this into context for us. How does this particular power struggle compare to past administrations?
Well, in past administrations, you had presidents who brought their own ideological view, often or some ideological bedrock view. President Trump has shifting views, and they're shifting sometimes week to week. They certainly have shifted considerably since the campaign, and of course in the campaign he was taking on a whole set of new views that were at odds with the ones he had taken when he was a citizen. So in a situation where you have a candidate at the top a president at the top who has such different views and whose views are easily changeable, that's new. We have had huge clashes between in the Reagan administration, which is considered a successful administration. You had situations where you had the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense wouldn't even talk to each other. That was also true in George W. Bush's administration, though there are more obvious reasons for why there were those kinds of clashes at a time where you had two two different wars going on. But it is not odd to have fights inside of White Houses. The Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, was also managed in a somewhat similar way to Donald Trump. Certainly, Bill Clinton was a voracious reader and a voracious consumer of information and was deeply curious. Those are traits that are not associated with President Trump. But in terms of somebody who kind of constantly keeps talking through a problem or who is influenced by the last person they talked to, those were also things attributed to Bill Clinton. And then you also had FDR was a president who liked to pit his advisors sort of against each other and let them kind of go at it, and then he would make his decision. That's been something that people have described as the way Donald Trump likes to manage, although I think he likes that in theory more than in practice, as he's told his top advisors to stop bickering because it's leaking out into the papers. So this kind of turmoil inside of a White House is not new. What is new, though, is that turmoil relative to a president who brings so little experience to the job.
All right. Well, John, before I let you go, what do you have on tap this weekend on Face the Nation?
Well, we have, for the Easter and Passover holiday, we have a panel of people who celebrate those two holidays and who think and write about religion in American life. And we also have a conversation with David McCullough about a lot of what you and I have been talking about, but also the question of American character, what shapes presidents, what shapes Americans, what endures across the ages, even when there are moments of flux and disruption. And we'll have our political roundtable, as always, to talk about the week's news. And we may have one other surprise, which we're still cooking up in the crock pot.
All right, a tease. John Dickerson, thank you so much. Really great to have you.
Thanks a lot, Elaine.
And don't forget to watch John this Sunday on Face the Nation. It airs at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern right here on CBSN.